Maria Garcia lived what many would call a perfect life, at least on the surface. A devout Muslim, she followed the traditions of her faith, dressed modestly, and maintained a strong sense of duty toward her husband, Julio, and their young daughter, Lily. They resided in a quiet suburban neighborhood where families often spent time together at barbecues and picnics. To the outside world, the Garcia family was the embodiment of happiness and success. Julio, a dedicated and hard-working man, had a well-paying job in the local business district, and Maria's role as a homemaker allowed her to take care of the household while raising Lily. Don Carlos, Julio's father, was a fixture in their home. A man of wealth and influence, he had built his fortune over many years through a variety of businesses. His reputation in the community was impeccable, and he was known for his wisdom, kindness, and generosity. He had always been a loving father to Julio, and as his son's wife, Maria had come to regard Don Carlos as a father figure. Despite the significant age gap, the relationship between Maria and her father-in-law had always been respectful. Yet, as the years passed, Maria began to feel increasingly isolated in her role as a wife and mother. Julio's job demanded long hours, often leaving him too tired to spend quality time with her. Maria, who had once been full of energy and optimism, now found herself feeling lonely and unappreciated. She tried to fill the emptiness by devoting herself entirely to her daughter, but the connection with Julio seemed to weaken. Though they were a family, Maria couldn't shake the sense that something was missing from her life. It was during this time that Don Carlos started spending more time at the house. Initially, his visits were casual, just checking in on his son and daughter-in-law, offering advice or discussing business. But slowly, he began to notice the subtle changes in Maria. The once vibrant woman had become withdrawn, and he saw the frustration in her eyes when Julio was absent. His concern for Maria's well-being grew, and he started spending more time with her alone, offering her comfort during those quiet moments when she felt most vulnerable. As their interactions increased, Maria started to feel a sense of comfort in her father-in-law's presence. He listened to her with a patience that Julio, consumed by work, couldn't offer. There was an undeniable connection between them, though neither of them acknowledged it at first. Don Carlos's charisma, wisdom seemed to fill the void in Maria's life, and she began to look forward to his visits. The small gestures of kindness, the lingering conversations, and the attention he gave her made her feel noticed in ways she hadn't felt in a long time. Maria didn't realize it, but over time she was slowly becoming emotionally dependent on Don Carlos. The unspoken tension between them grew stronger with each passing day. What started as a comforting presence soon transformed into something more dangerous, a bond neither of them fully understood, yet both were drawn to. They never crossed any physical boundaries at first, but their connection was undeniable. Maria, in her loneliness, found herself seeking out her father-in-law's company, and he, in turn, began to enjoy the attention of a woman who saw him not just as a father, but as someone with whom she could share a deeper connection. This was the beginning of something neither of them could foresee, a path that would lead them far from the innocent friendship they once shared and into a web of secrecy that would shatter everything they knew. As the days passed, the connection between Maria and Don Carlos deepened. What had begun as innocent conversations slowly transformed into moments of shared intimacy that neither of them could ignore. Don Carlos, aware of the shift in their relationship, struggled with his feelings. He had always respected Maria, but now he found himself increasingly drawn to her in ways he had never intended. Maria, on the other hand, was no longer the woman who had once been content in her role as a wife and mother. The absence of affection from Julio had left a void in her heart, and Don Carlos filled it in a way that made her feel valued and understood. Their secret encounters became more frequent. At first, it was just small gestures, lingering touches as they passed each other in the kitchen, a brief but meaningful look exchanged during dinner, the way Don Carlos would take her hand for a moment of comfort when Julio wasn't around. Maria tried to resist the growing attraction, but it became harder and harder to ignore the way her heart raced when he was near. She began to seek out these moments, whether it was finding an excuse to linger in the living room or offering to help him with tasks around the house. The more time they spent together, the more their connection intensified. Don Carlos, despite his age, was still a handsome man, his charisma never waning, and Maria found herself captivated by his attention. He had always been charming, but now his words carried a weight that struck her deeply. He spoke to her not as a daughter-in-law, but as a woman, someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered. Maria, in her loneliness, craved this kind of attention, and soon their relationship crossed a line that could not be undone. It wasn't until one evening, when Giulio worked late into the night, that the tension between them finally erupted. They were alone in the house, and for the first time, neither of them tried to hold back. The forbidden attraction that had been building for months came to a head as they shared a passionate kiss. For Maria, it was a moment of overwhelming desire, a release from the emotional strain she had been carrying for so long. She had never imagined herself in this situation. Yet in that moment, it felt like a long-awaited escape from the emptiness that had plagued her life. For Don Carlos, the kiss was a confirmation of the feelings he had tried to deny. He knew it was wrong, knew that their actions would destroy everything if anyone ever found out. Yet, in that moment, he couldn't bring himself to stop. The line between right and wrong blurred in the heat of their embrace, and both were swept up in the intensity of their emotions. It wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about the emotional connection that had grown between them, a connection that neither of them could deny any longer. The next morning, the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. They both knew that they could never go back to the way things were. The affair had begun, and it would be impossible to stop now. Maria's heart was torn between guilt and the overpowering need to feel desired. She had betrayed her husband, but at that moment it seemed like the price of feeling alive again was worth it. Don Carlos, too, knew that they had crossed a dangerous line, but the pull between them was undeniable. They were trapped in a dangerous dance of passion and deceit, one that would soon unravel their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. What started as a secret flirtation had spiraled into something neither of them could control, and as the days turned into weeks, their affair became a dangerous game of cat and mouse. They had no idea how much longer they could keep up the charade, but they were both too entangled in the web they had created to stop. They couldn't turn back, not now, not when the thrill of their forbidden love had taken root so deeply in their hearts. Giulio began to notice the subtle changes in Maria's behavior, although at first he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was wrong. She had always been a devoted wife, affectionate and attentive, but lately she seemed distracted, distant even. Their once lively conversations had become short and mechanical, and the spark they once shared seemed to have faded. It wasn't just that she was less engaged in their relationship. There was something about her demeanor that made Giulio uneasy. Her smiles no longer reached her eyes, and the warmth that had characterized their home seemed to be slipping away. He initially brushed it off as stress from managing the house and caring for Lily. After all, she had her hands full with their daughter and her responsibilities as a homemaker. But as the days went by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. Maria's mood swings became more pronounced. Sometimes she would be overly irritable, snapping at him for small things, and other times she would retreat into herself, lost in thought, as if preoccupied with something he couldn't see. One evening, when he returned from work earlier than expected, he found her sitting alone on the couch, staring blankly at the television. It was a quiet moment, and for a brief instant, he considered asking her if something was wrong, but the words caught in his throat. Maria looked up at him, and there was a fleeting moment where their eyes met, but the connection between them felt strained, almost distant. It was then that Giulio noticed something else, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set her coffee cup down, the way she quickly turned her head when he tried to catch her gaze for too long. As the days went on, Giulio couldn't ignore his suspicions any longer. He began to pay closer attention to the little things: Maria's behavior, her interactions with Don Carlos, and even the way she acted when he was around. He had never questioned their family dynamics before, but now he felt a gnawing sense that something wasn't quite right. Julio started to observe the way Maria and his father interacted during family dinners. Don Carlos had always been a prominent figure in their household, but lately, there was something about his presence that seemed different. There was a certain intimacy between them, an unspoken understanding that felt out of place. They exchanged quiet words and glances when he wasn't looking, and the more Julio observed, the more unsettled he became. His mind raced with possibilities, but he dismissed them at first, thinking it was just his imagination running wild. One afternoon, Julio's growing doubts reached a boiling point when he saw something that would haunt him forever. He walked into the living room unexpectedly, only to find Maria and Don Carlos standing too close to each other, their faces inches apart. It was a brief moment, but in that instant, Julio's heart sank. Maria quickly pulled away, and Don Carlos cleared his throat awkwardly, but the damage was done. The tension in the air was palpable, and Julio's worst fears began to take shape. He asked Maria if everything was all right between them, but she brushed off his concerns with an assurance that everything was fine. Her smile, though, seemed forced, and the more she denied it, the more suspicious Julio became. That evening, he found himself unable to sleep, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. His trust in her had been shattered, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him. The weight of his suspicion grew heavier each day, and Julio knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The distance between them had become too great, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he was overthinking things, deep down, he knew something had changed. The question now was what he would do with this knowledge, and whether he could handle the truth if it was far worse than he feared. Julio's worst fears were confirmed when he stumbled upon Maria's phone one evening, lying carelessly on the kitchen counter. He had been pacing the house, his mind racing with suspicions, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. His hand hesitated for a moment as he saw the unlocked phone, but his curiosity got the better of him. Maria had always been diligent about keeping her phone to herself, but this time there was no lock, no screen timeout. Julio knew it was a mistake, but in that moment he couldn't stop himself. He glanced at the screen, only intending to check a missed notification, but as he swiped through the apps, he found something far more devastating. Messages, dozens of them. They were from Don Carlos. At first, Julio couldn't make sense of them, but as his eyes skimmed through the conversation, his heart sank. The words were loaded with emotions, far beyond the casual exchanges one might expect between a father and his daughter-in-law. "I miss you," one message read. Another said, "I can't stop thinking about you." The texts were full of longing, and the implications of their intimacy were undeniable. Julio's hand shook as he scrolled through more messages, some graphic, others deeply personal. His stomach twisted in knots. This was no simple flirtation, it was an affair. Julio's mind went numb. The rage, the shock, the betrayal all hit him at once, but he couldn't make sense of it. He had always trusted Maria. He had always trusted his father. How could this happen? How could they do this to him? The messages were too much to process. The words, each one more damning than the last, made his blood run cold. He felt as though the ground beneath him had given way, and the once solid foundation of his family was now nothing more than rubble. Maria had walked into the room without him hearing her footsteps, and when she saw him standing there with her phone in his hand, she knew what he had discovered. Her face turned pale, her lips trembling. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She was caught. There was no denying it now. The truth was out. Julio, unable to hold back the surge of anger, demanded to know what was going on. His voice trembled with a mix of rage and heartbreak as he confronted her. Maria stood still, unable to look him in the eye. She had never imagined this moment would come, yet here it was. The guilt gnawed at her insides, but in the face of her husband's anger, she found herself at a loss for words. She had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Don Carlos had appeared in the doorway, his presence like a dark cloud. There was no turning back now. Julio turned to him, his face twisted in disbelief, and for the first time, Don Carlos looked less like the respected patriarch of their family and more like a man who had made a terrible mistake. He didn't try to justify his actions, nor did he apologize. Instead, he stood there, silent and regretful, but still unmoving. It was as if the weight of what had happened had finally dawned on him, but it was too late for remorse. In that moment, something inside Giulio snapped. The betrayal was too much to bear. His father, the man he had looked up to all his life, had violated the trust of their family in the worst possible way. The anger consumed him, and without thinking, he lunged at Don Carlos. The confrontation turned physical, and the two men struggled, their emotions boiling over in a chaotic mess of fists and shouts. But in the heat of the moment, something happened that neither of them could have anticipated. As the struggle continued, Giulio pushed Don Carlos away, and in the confusion, the older man stumbled backward, his balance faltering. He fell hard, hitting his head on the sharp corner of the coffee table with a sickening thud. Time seemed to slow as everyone froze, the air thick with shock. Giulio, panting heavily, watched in horror as his father's body lay motionless on the floor. Maria screamed, rushing to his side, but it was too late. Don Carlos was dead. The house, once filled with the sounds of family life, fell silent. The weight of what had just happened crushed them all. Giulio stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he had just done. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He hadn't meant to hurt his father. But in that moment, the betrayal and the shock had overwhelmed him, and the consequences were irreversible. Maria, in a state of panic, tried desperately to revive Don Carlos, but there was no hope. She was left with the unbearable reality of what her affair had led to. The guilt and horror of the situation quickly gave way to fear. They were trapped. The accident had happened, but the truth was far more complicated than they could ever have imagined. And with that, the lives of everyone involved were changed forever. The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours to Maria. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt cold and foreign. Maria's mind raced as she stood next to Don Carlos's lifeless body. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and the weight of her actions crushed her. She had not only betrayed her husband, but she had also played a part in the death of the man she had once respected as a father. She didn't know what to say or how to explain the horrific series of events that had just unfolded. All she could think about was the fear that gripped her heart, fear of losing everything. The police quickly began their investigation, treating Don Carlos's death as suspicious. Giulio, standing at the edge of the room, was still in shock. His chest tightened as he realized the full extent of the tragedy. He hadn't meant to kill his father. In his rage and his betrayal, he had acted without thinking. Now the reality of the situation was inescapable. Maria, desperate to protect herself and avoid the consequences of the affair, tried to piece together a story. She claimed it was an accident, just a tragic fall. It was the only explanation she could offer. The thought of anyone discovering the truth was too much for her to bear. Detective Anna Hollow, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, was assigned to the case. She entered the scene with a methodical calm, but her eyes missed nothing. Maria's story seemed rehearsed, too perfect to be true. Anna questioned everyone, looking for inconsistencies, and the more she listened, the more she sensed something was off. There were too many unanswered questions. Why was Don Carlos alone with Maria and Giulio? Why had Giulio acted so impulsively? Why did the fall seem so sudden and unnatural? The investigation soon uncovered details that led to Maria's affair with Don Carlos. Detective Harlow discovered the texts, the messages that had painted a picture of a forbidden relationship, one that had gone on for months. Maria had tried to erase the evidence, but the digital trail was too clear to ignore. The affair was the motive, the catalyst for everything that had unfolded. But it wasn't just the affair that made Detective Harlow suspicious, it was the way Maria had acted after Don Carlos's death. Her behavior, her reluctance to show genuine grief, seemed out of place. Maria was arrested after the evidence became undeniable. The police knew they had to pursue the truth, even if it shattered the illusion of a perfect family. The truth, as painful as it was, had to come to light. As the investigation continued, it was clear that Maria and Giulio's lives would never be the same. The betrayal, the lies, and the tragedy had destroyed everything they had built together. Giulio, tormented by guilt, couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. He had loved his father, and yet, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, he had taken his life. The weight of the act crushed him, and he withdrew into himself, unable to face anyone, including Maria. He had never imagined that the woman he had loved so deeply could betray him in such a way. Now, he was left to reckon with the consequences of his own actions. The trial that followed was a media frenzy. The details of Maria's affair with Don Carlos were exposed for the world to see, and the public was shocked by the depth of the betrayal. People who had once admired the Garcia family now watched in disbelief as the story of their downfall played out on the evening news. Maria, facing charges of manslaughter for her role in Don Carlos's death, was left to confront the consequences of her choices. She had destroyed everything she had worked for: her family, her reputation, and her faith. The story didn't end with the trial, though. The fallout was far-reaching. The Garcia family's legacy was tarnished forever. Julio, still reeling from the horror of that night, found himself isolated, alienated from the world that had once loved him. The trust he had placed in his father and his wife was shattered beyond repair. He knew that he could never undo what had been done. Maria, now facing years of imprisonment and the loss of her daughter, had no idea how to move forward. She had ruined everything for a fleeting moment of passion, and now the consequences were too great to bear. In the end, the truth had come to light, but at what cost? A family had been torn apart by lies and betrayal, and the lives of everyone involved were irreparably changed. The pain, the guilt, and the regret would linger long after the trial, a haunting reminder of how one dark secret could destroy everything. The Garcia family's story, once filled with hope and promise, had ended in tragedy.